Determine the left-sided limit and the right-sided limit, and the two-sided limit is x approaches pi over 2 of 1 divided by sine squared x minus 2 sine x plus 1. Each of these involves the limit is x approaches pi over 2 of 1 divided by sine squared x minus 2 sine x plus 1. The first thing to do is try plugging a pi over 2 in for each of the x's. That will give 1 divided by sine squared of pi over 2, which means sine of pi over 2 and then squared, minus 2 times the sine of pi over 2 and then plus 1, which is 1 divided by sine of pi over 2 is a 1, so 1 squared minus 2 times 1 plus 1, which equals 1 divided by 1 squared is 1, minus 2 times 1 is minus 2, plus 1, which equals 1 divided by 1 minus 2 is a negative 1, and then plus 1 is a 0. That 0 in the denominator is not actually a 0, since x is only approaching pi over 2 here. It does not reach pi over 2. But a limit result of a non-zero number over 0 equals to either positive infinity or negative infinity, where the sign of the infinity often depends on the side the limit is approaching from. We therefore have to work out each of the one-sided limits separately. We have the left-sided limit indicated by the negative superscript on the pi over 2. Of the 1 over sine squared x minus 2 sine x plus 1. And the right-sided limit indicated by the positive superscript on the pi over 2. And 1 over sine squared x minus 2 sine x plus 1. Let's start with the left-sided limit. The denominator is actually a trinomial quadratic, and therefore we will want to factor that before anything else. So if the limit is x approaches pi over 2 from the left side of 1 over, it's a trinomial quadratic since there is a sine squared term, a sine term, and then a constant term. It will factor into a sine x and another sine x. We need two numbers that multiply to be a positive 1 and add to be a negative 2. Negative 1 and negative 1 will take care of that. And so the factors match each other. And therefore this can be written as the factors multiplying by being quantity squared. Sine of x minus 1 squared. Now we can analyze what's making 0 in the denominator. As x approaches pi over 2, sine of pi over 2 is a 1, and 1 minus 1 is 0. So that's the factor that's making the 0. We're approaching pi over 2 from the left side. The left side of pi over 2 is less than pi over 2. On the unit circle, that'll put it in the first quadrant near pi over 2, but less than pi over 2. The sign of something less than pi over 2 is going to be something less than the sign of pi over 2, which is a 1, because sign can never become greater than 1. Sign of something less than pi over 2 is less than 1, like 0.99. It'll be close to 1 as it approaches to pi over 2. But if we put 0.99 in for sine of x minus 1, that'll be a negative number, though it will approach 0 as x approaches to pi over 2. So we can replace sine of x minus 1 with a negative 0. We would then plug pi over 2 in for any remaining x's, but there is no other x's, so it'll just be 1 over the negative 0 squared, which is a 1 divided by negative squared is positive, 0 squared is 0. The 1 in the numerator is a positive 1. Positive over positive is positive. Non-zero over 0 is an infinity, and there is the left-sided limit. The right-sided limit will work out in a similar fashion. It will factor exactly the same. And the matching factors can multiply together to become quantity squared in the denominator. This is the right-sided limit. The right side of pi over 2 is greater than pi over 2, which puts it in the second quadrant. If pi over 2 sine is equal to a 1, it's something greater than pi over 2, sine will be less than 1 again. Sine never goes greater than 1. So it can only be equal to 1 or something lesser. And so it will be less than 1, like 0.99. So we can think of sine of x as being 0.99. If we subtract 1 from that, we have a negative number. It will approach to a 0, but it will stay negative. So we can replace sine x minus 1 with a negative 0. And then plug a pi over 2 in for all the remaining x's. But there is no other x's, so it'll just end up being 1 divided by negative 0 squared, which is 1 over negative squared is positive, 0 squared is 0. In the numerator, that 1 is positive. Positive over positive is positive. Non-zero over 0 is infinity. And there's the result of the right-sided limit. The two-sided limit depends on the results of the one-sided limits. They match each other here. The two-sided limit back up here will also be positive infinity. And there is the results of the three different limits.